Hello, History of Medicine students. This is Professor Bowen here, back with another video. This one offering you some tips on how to put together the third part of your research project, which is going to be a bibliography of primary sources. At this stage of your research, you've already put together a proposal and have assembled a list of 7 secondary sources related to your research question. Well, in order to complete this project, you want not only secondary sources, but also primary sources. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what primary sources are and offer some tips as to how you might best locate some that suit the nature of your project, whatever it is. The instructions for part 3 of the research project are as follows. First, you need to locate 3 primary sources that speak to the research question you've raised. Second, once you have those 3 sources, you need to compose a works cited page that is just like the one that you submitted as part 2 of this project, your secondary source bibliography, in accordance with Chicago footnote style, or sometimes also called notes and bibliography style. In addition to your 3 sources, I want part 3 of the research project to also include an updated version of your proposal. This will be your opportunity to talk to me about what has changed with regard to your project over the last couple of weeks. Hopefully, you've made some headway on this. Hopefully, you've been able to sharpen the scope of your research by zeroing in on a really specific question in the history of medicine connected to your topic. I've tried to give you some useful comments in those regards, and I would like this part of the project to also just tell me what's changed with regard to your topic and your research question since you began this project. Once you have all 3 of those things, then you need to put them all together in a single document, which will need to be submitted to me via Moodle by midnight, Sunday, October 4th. So one of the things that you might be wondering is, what exactly is a primary source? There is some unnecessary confusion about this in some corners of academia. Sometimes you read lists where people try to differentiate primary versus secondary sources on the basis of what kind of source that you're dealing with. They might say things like, for example, a newspaper article or a diary is an example of a primary source, whereas a textbook is an example of a secondary source. I suppose those things could be primary and secondary sources, but it's actually a lot more simpler than that. Anything can be a primary source, whether it is a written text, a photograph, a piece of music, an image, artwork, architectural remains, even skeletal remains. All of these things can be primary sources, so long as they come from the time period that you are studying. That, in history, is how we make the distinction between a primary source and a secondary source. A primary source is one that was created or published in the time period that you are studying, and it can literally be anything. Historians usually think of primary sources as the raw data of the past. This is the kind of unfiltered, unvarnished raw material that we use to construct our accounts of the past. So primary sources are things that haven't been analyzed, that haven't been interpreted or put into some kind of historical narrative by a scholar. Often we think of primary sources as things that give us kind of unmediated, unfiltered, first-hand experience of whatever the event or the person or the place that we're studying is. And this is why some people say things like, oh, a diary or a memoir or a letter is a primary source because that was written by the person who lived at the time and experienced these events. And yes, that is typically a good way of thinking about primary sources. Those are all examples of things that could be primary sources. Again, the key factor is, when was it published? If it came from the time period that you're working on, then it counts as a primary source. Now, of course, sometimes things do get a little bit dicey. Depending on the nature of your research question, sometimes primary sources can be secondary sources and vice versa. For example, if I was reading a book about medicine in 20th century China, a book that consisted of primary sources written by an historian, most people would say, oh, that's a secondary source. And if I was interested in learning about 20th century Chinese medicine, it would be a secondary source. But let's imagine that I had a slightly different project. What if, for example, I wanted to focus on the scholarship itself and talk about how historical approaches to the study of 20th century Chinese medicine changed over time? Then those same secondary source accounts would be, for me, primary sources. So in those cases, it does get a little bit blurry, the distinction between the two, but for the most part, again, if it was written in the time period that you're studying, it is a primary source. So how do you find a good primary source? I want to walk you through a couple of different methods that you might find useful as you go across the internet looking for old manuscripts and other kinds of historical texts that speak to your research question. Of course, most historians, when they are writing books or articles, they go to archives or libraries or other kinds of physical places where they look at, handwritten or typed up physical copies of documents. Many of those libraries and archives have now been shuttered because of COVID-19. You can't actually get into them. So that's not something we have an opportunity to do in this course. Also, because this course is just a one-semester project, we don't have the time or the money to travel to distant locations to do in-person research in actual buildings like libraries or archives. So we're going to be looking online for our primary sources. We're going to be taking advantage of the many collections of primary source materials that over the years have been digitized and made available to us at the click of a mouse button, the touch of our fingertips. We're looking at things that we can access from the comfort of our own homes. And thankfully, there are many different kinds of primary sources you can get just a fingertip click away. So, one of the first methods that I would suggest here is to begin with your secondary sources. Looking through the references or the works cited page of your secondary sources is a good way to see what the scholars you're reading have themselves done research on in terms of primary sources. You can sometimes also get a glimpse at their primary sources by looking through their footnotes or their endnotes. And when doing this, you sometimes come across things that you yourself can look up, track down, and incorporate into your own research. It's kind of a form of stealing, but it works. So if you'll remember, when I first began this instructional series, I proposed the topic of women's medicine and health in Ming Dynasty China. And one of my secondary sources was this article by Yi Li Wu called Body, Gender, and Disease, the Female Breast in Late Imperial Chinese Medicine. So I flip to the end of this article after I'm done reading it. I see the reference section, and if I look through her bibliography, I come across one particular source. Just by looking at the date, you can see it says compiled 610. It is ancient. It was published a long time ago. It is a primary source. It is a treatise on the origins and manifestations of the myriad diseases. So I come across a source like that, and now if I wanted to, I could go to the internet, hop over to Google, for example, type it into the search engine box, and see what comes up. Sometimes you will not find what you're looking for. Sometimes your search is a failure. This is particularly the case when you're dealing with the history of non-Western medicines, because there just have been fewer translated and digitized texts available for research in things like medieval Chinese medicine. However, I kept at it, and I proceeded to scroll through more of Yi Li Wu's bibliography here, and I came across another source called the 24 Filial Exemplars. And in Yi Li Wu's bibliography, this is actually listed as an online source, so I know that it must be available on the internet. So I searched for it in Google, and I found the website that has it conveniently translated into English so I can understand it. And it's all of these excerpts from the medieval manuscript that Yi Li Wu was working with when she put together this article. Now, I'm not sure if this particular source speaks to my exact research question. I'd have to go through and see if it is an applicable source for me, if it's a good one to include, but this is a tried and true way of locating primary sources. Just use those that your secondary sources have used themselves. By doing this, you can also often come across related sources that may not be in your secondary source bibliographies, but you might come across them while doing more general research. So when looking at Yi Li Wu's Works Cited page, I found references to a book called Chinese Healing and Medicine, which is an illustrated history. And that book, interestingly, contains a number of vignettes. Almost every single chapter in this illustrated history has several pages of block primary source text that different historians have translated from Chinese into English. And one of the entries in this volume is called The Combined Collection of Female Alchemy. It was translated in 2008 by the historian of Chinese medicine, Elena Valusi. And it's 3 or 4 pages. This is just one of them that I've taken a photograph of and put here up on the screen. This is also another way that I could look for primary sources. In terms of translations, particularly when you're dealing with non-Western medical topics, I've often found that a good place to go for translations is master's theses and dissertations. Because in the process of conducting an historical analysis of old texts, graduate students often produce translations of them. And these are just a couple of examples that you could find online, read those chapters, and use them as primary source texts. The next option for you would be to scour the internet for online collections. There are actually lots of these. If you pop over to Google, type something like History of Medicine, online, primary sources, you'll come across some of these, and they are often very helpful. They contain master lists of databases that take you to other websites where you can do things like download primary sources potentially related to your topic. In my search on history of Chinese medicine, I found one particular online repository that had a collection of primary source reports from the 19th century. These were texts written by Western medical missionaries in China, and they are available for my viewing pleasure right on the internet. Not that difficult to obtain, in fact. The third option that you might want to consider for your project is source books and readers. These are anthologies or collections of primary sources that have been put together in a single volume and that you can search for, and if you find something interesting in them, You can request a source through our library, through ILL, see if you can get it, and that's a way of also finding another primary source. Lastly, how to cite these sources. Here's some info on that.